Variables are one of the most important tools you are ever going to use in all of programming. They give us a quick and easy way to label data so that we can actually use it effectively. So why is it that we spend so little time trying to use them properly? Bad variable names are something that we have all done and all regretted at some point in our programming career. So let's talk a little bit today about how you can make your variable names great without putting so much effort into it that you don't have time for anything else. Hello, fellow humans, and welcome to Computer Science for Humans, where we take programming concepts and simplify them into everyday terms for everyday people. As a quick note before we start, I want to mention an article that was hugely formative for me in my own journey into software development, especially when it comes to naming variables well. It's by a guy named Arlo Belshi, at least I think that's how you pronounce his name. He has a blog called Arlo Being Bloody Stupid, his name, not mine, where he talks about a variety of good programming practices and stuff like that. There's a specific article series that he wrote, I guess, a long time ago, that talks specifically about naming your variables and how you can do a really good job at it. It's called Good Naming is a Process, Not a Single Step. And like I said, this was hugely formative for me, and some of the core concepts I'm taking are from that article. He explains them very well. If you want to read a very detailed description of all of this stuff, I highly recommend you give that a read if you can find it. I'll put some links down below to his website and the closest I could get to the links for the article, but I think he might have moved the article. I'm not really sure, but I definitely wanted to give him credit where credit is due because it's a fantastic article that goes into tons of depth. It's really good. It's also worth mentioning he has something like 7 steps to naming variables. I found in my own personal practice, and particularly when I tried to explain some of these concepts to fellow coworkers and to students of mine, most people don't really get a lot of pragmatic use out of anything past about step 4 from what he did. So yeah, if you want to read a really detailed version, go follow the link below to his article, or at least the website that I think has his article somewhere on the website. Maybe you're better at navigating websites than me. I sound like a boomer. So definitely give his blog a look if you're interested in leveling up your programming skills. Now, we're not going to be following his techniques exactly in this video. Instead, we're going to be using the process that I personally use in my own coding and that I generally try to teach to my students. And I found that that process is usually simple enough to pick up very quickly, while also being useful enough to work in just about any context. One last thing before we get started. As we go through this, remember, you don't have to do every single step every single time. I'm giving you all of the steps so that you have the tools in your tool belt to use them, but feel free to skip or mix and match steps as needed. Ultimately, whatever works for your program is what you should be doing. On to the variables. When it comes to making good variable names, you can really break it down into about 3 steps. And because we're programmers, of course we have to start at 0. I call step 0 actually using names. Sounds kind of funny to say, like, of course you're using names for variables. Variables basically just a name. But the reason this step is here is because it's pretty easy to have a section of code that tries to do too many things all at once. And in those situations, just using a variable can actually make your code a lot cleaner. And by cleaner, I mean easier to read, use, and maintain. So let's take a look at an example so you can see what kind of situation you might come across where you're not currently using a variable name and you might need to. So here I have a file with some examples for us to work through over the course of this video. If you want to work on it a little more hands-on and have it on your own computer, I do have a link to the GitHub repository down below. It's completely free. You don't have to sign up for an email list or anything. It's literally just a GitHub repository. So feel free to fork it or just clone it or whatever, have it on your own computer and play around with it as we go through this video. Okay, so we're going to take a look at too much at once. If you're like me, you look at this function and you immediately think that is a lot and I don't really feel like thinking about it very hard. And the thing to remember here is clean code. The whole purpose of having clean code, good variable names, things like that, is so that when we're looking over hundreds of thousands of lines of code, we minimize the amount of ugh that our brain feels when looking at the code so that you can look at more code for longer without getting mentally fatigued. And ultimately, the goal with all of this, with pretty much everything I teach actually, is to have code where when you look at the code, the purpose is obvious. So you don't have to wonder, wait, why did they write this line? You can see from the way things are named, okay, this is what this is here for. This is the purpose it fulfills within the code. So that's the mentality that we want to keep while we're going over this. So when I see code like this, my first thought is this is doing too much in one place. It's kind of a mess. So let's take this chunk and break it down into multiple smaller pieces that we can more easily digest mentally. And of course, one of the easiest ways to break things into smaller pieces is by using variables. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into this line and I'm going to find sections of this massive chunk of code that I can pull out into variables. This process is part of what we call refactoring, which if you're not familiar, I should probably have a video on that. I'm sure I will at some point. Refactoring is basically the art of changing your code without changing what it does. And usually when we talk about refactoring your code, the purpose is to make it cleaner and easier to read. When we refactor, we want to clean up our code without making it do something different. The particular refactoring we're going to use right now is called extract variable, which is basically just a fancy way of saying take stuff and put it into a variable. Pretty simple. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at this and determine where are some spots in this code that it would make sense to extract that section into a variable of its own. And before I do this, go ahead and pause the video for a moment, take just a few seconds to think about it, and identify sections of this line that could be pulled out into their own variable. And don't worry, there's no grade on this, there's no right or wrong answer. There's actually a bunch of different ways you could do this, and most of them are completely valid. Pause it for a few seconds, I'll be here when you get back. Okay, so let's get going. For me, the first thing I see as a section that could be a variable is this max minus min. It's already in its own parentheses, it's already kind of sectioned out from everything, so let's turn it into a variable. I'm going to use the refactoring tools from Visual Studio Code. Most coding environments have something along these lines, some kind of refactoring tools. So whichever coding environment you're using, whether it's Visual Studio Code, Visual Studio, IntelliJ, WebStorm, whatever, they usually have some kind of refactoring tools that you can use. And it works a little differently with each program. I'm using this menu because I don't think Visual Studio Code, at least as far as I know, has shortcut keys for it. But if it does have shortcut keys, whichever one you're using, I highly recommend learning them because it makes things so much faster. So you can see this extracted that code that we had selected into a variable. Now we get to the first part where we're actually dealing with a name. So this is an interesting thing because new local doesn't tell me anything at all about this variable. It just tells me that it's a variable. You might as well have thing or number or, Bob, you could call it. The point here is we have given it a name and we've pulled it out of the overall equation that's down below. For now, we're gonna leave this as it is, new local. This is what Arlo Belshi calls a nonsense name. The only purpose of a nonsense name is organization. It doesn't give you any information. So looking at these, I'm gonna do this a few more times with different sections. Again, know that there are a bunch of different ways you can do this and you don't have to do it exactly the way I do it. For the purpose of explaining this concept completely, I'm gonna be very, very thorough with this, but you don't have to be this thorough, and this isn't the only right way to do it. So next I'm going to take this math.random because it's got some non-letter symbols in it and it's a little clunky looking. It seems like a decent thing to put into a variable. And again, we've got another nonsense name with that. Then we've got these two variables multiplied by each other. That looks like a decent thing to extract into its own variable. Just realize there is a shortcut key here, Control-Shift-R. Okay, we got new local 2. And you can see that even now, this line is so much less complicated. New local 2 still doesn't have a lot of meaning to it. So that's definitely something we'll want to change later. But for now, we're just organizing. We don't have to name everything yet. We're still using nonsense names. And that's why we call this step 0, is because we're going from no name to a name. Next, we'll do this. And then I'm going to take this math.floor because that just looks a little more complex than I'm going for right now. And then, because right now I'm doing the most meticulous way of doing this, again, you don't always have to be this meticulous, I'm going to go ahead and put this into a variable as well. And it stopped at 4, so let me go ahead and put 5 here. So you may be wondering, why in the world would you ever do this in this way? This seems so overkill, putting literally every operation into its own variable. And in most situations, this is going to be overkill and you don't need to do this. However, if you're ever in a situation where you're looking at code that makes absolutely no sense and you are completely baffled and you just can't wrap your mind around what it's doing it like this and putting each individual operation into its own variable can be a fantastic way to break it down into tiny little pieces, and it will help you understand what the code is actually doing. And hopefully you'll get to see that firsthand in just a moment when we go on to step 1. But for now, let's take this and compare it to what it used to be and just kind of examine the difference. So here they are side by side. You can see there's a big difference in how it looks, but hopefully you can see the one on the bottom looks a lot easier to work your way through. It looks longer, that's true, but you at least have the step-by-step breakdown and you don't have to wonder what order things happen in. It's very obvious. So even though we've just named these variables like new local 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, even though the names don't tell you anything at all, the fact that it's separating it out is actually tremendously helpful just for helping our brains to organize the information. Now we don't have to sort all the different parentheses out in our mind to understand the code. We actually can just look at each step-by-step thing. And whether you know what this code does or not, if you do, that's awesome. But even if you don't know what it does, that's kind of the point. We're going at this as if we don't know what this code does beforehand. And what we're going to do is we're going to use the variable names in order to figure out what this code actually does. And if you do already know what it does because you've done it before or you just figured it out already, then that's awesome. For the purpose of this exercise, try to think of it as if you don't know what it already does. The point here with step 0 is that a name that's garbage is better than no name at all. And I don't know about you, but I would take this over this any day. A couple side notes that are just kind of interesting to keep in mind here of why the second one is better. There's an interesting kind of psychological phenomenon that your brain has an easier time tracking information, at least with code, tracking information vertically than it does horizontally. So if you go off the screen sideways, it's actually like really confusing. And if you go off the screen vertically, it's not that bad. For example, if you think about scrolling on a website of some kind, scrolling up and down is no big deal. You just, you go down to the next thing. But if something goes off the side of the screen, it's usually really obnoxious. Or maybe that's just me. Let me know in the comments down below what you think. And the same concept applies here. I'll put a link down below to a kind of a TED Talk sort of thing where a guy explains that in more detail very evocatively. The other interesting thing to note here is even though our names mean pretty much nothing, if you had to go in and edit this code to make it do something different, say you have to add, some extra calculations in there, which one of these would you rather edit? I would rather have to edit this than this. This one, there is so much that could go wrong as you edit, it would be a pain. But this one, you just find the line you need to change and then change it. All that to say, there are a lot of little benefits you may not suspect of just using a few extra variables here and there that can be really useful. Now that we have some nonsense names in place, we have variable names to edit. So next we're going to go to step 1, which is no more nonsense. What's important to remember here is the goal is not to find the perfect name for this variable. So we're not trying to do it all in one step. All we're trying to do is make our nonsense names a little bit better. And this is a key pattern that you'll find throughout all of clean programming, and it's something that I teach all of my students, and that is you don't have to get it right, you just need to make it a little bit better each time. So let's take a look at all these nonsense names and let's turn them into actual names. So let's take a look at this one first. This variable holds a maximum minus a minimum. Take a moment and think what you would call this. Again, don't take super long. The point here is we're just gonna give it a quick name. So for me, when I see this, I immediately think of a range. Let's go to the next line. Math.random. If you're familiar with JavaScript, then you'll know that this basically, it gives you a random percent between 0 and 1, with 0 being 0%, 1 being 1%, 100% rather, and it just gives you a random amount between there. Since it's math.random, I'm just gonna call it random. As a side note, I'm using F2 to rename. It'll rename each usage of that variable, which is really nice. So now on to the next line. This is where it starts to get kind of cool. So we've renamed these two variables so they're not local 1 and local 2. And this gives us a little bit more insight into what exactly new local 2 is. It's a random, so a random percent times a range. So that's interesting. So it's choosing a random point within that range because it's a random percentage of the range. So I'm just going to call it value. Again, we don't need fancy names here. It's a value that was chosen within the range. On to the next one. We have the value plus the minimum. And again, that's more information than we had a minute ago. So what this is doing, remember at the beginning, we got the range by subtracting the minimum from the maximum, and that shifts it over to 0. So now what we're doing is unshifting it back to the original range. So I'm just gonna call this true value, because that's the actual value in the actual number range. On to new local 4, we are doing math.floor of true value. Math.floor basically just means round down. So if you have like 4.7, math.floor would turn that into just 4. You could also call it truncating the value. I'm gonna call this rounded. It's just taking a decimal and turning it into a whole number. And we've got new local 5 as our last one. All it's doing is selecting something from an array. So I'm gonna call this selection. So you can see with just a tiny bit of effort, I mean, I've hardly put any effort at all into these variable names. It's not in my script or anything. I kind of just made them up as I went. I spent maybe 10 seconds on each one, if that. And just with that tiny little change, the function is so much easier to read than it used to be. You can now see there's a flow to the logic with just these tiny little steps. All we've done is take the sections out, turn them into a variable, and then give the variable a very basic name. Let's just compare these two real quick and just look at the difference. I would much rather have the bottom one than the top one. This is just so much nicer. Yes, it's a little clunky, but the fact of the matter is this is way more clunky because it's doing the exact same thing as this, but it's squishing it all together. So now we've done step 0, where we gave it a name, and we have step 1, where we make the name not a nonsense name. Now we're gonna go to step 2, where it actually starts to get a little bit interesting. Because like I said before, usually you're gonna skip step 0 and go straight to this step. And most people never go beyond this step. So this is where we start to get into techniques that a lot of people literally never even use. Now that we've got some actual variable names to work with, we can start kicking it up a notch. Like I said, a lot of people don't even bother with steps past this. Where we are now is kind of the default that most people go into when they do their programming. And if you skip step 0 and go straight here, that's fine. That's totally fine. But if you want to write good code, clean code that'll be easy to work with for you and other people in the future, then there are still some really easy steps we can take to make it just a little bit better. We're going to take our some sense names and we're going to make them a bit more accurate. And now that we have these names and not just a jumble of math, we can actually look at the overall context of this function and try to figure out more what it actually does and rename the variables based on what they're doing more so than what they hold. For example, with this range, now that we've seen the entire usage of range within the function, we can actually have a better guess at what kind of range it is. So specifically, we know that we have a range here. We get a random value within the range, we round it so it's not a decimal number, and then we get that number from an array. What we're really doing here is picking a random value from a section of an array. With that in mind, go ahead and take a couple seconds here, pause the video if you need to, and think about some possible names for the range variable. Think about what you might name it. So as I'm looking at this, what I notice about range is that it's almost correct. We're trying to make these names more accurate than they are, but range is already most of the way there. There's just a little bit of information that we can add to it in order to make it a little bit more clear. Specifically, this isn't just a range, it's not some range of numbers that's kind of meaningless, it's the range that we have zeroed out. You remember, we took the range and then we moved it to 0 so that we could get a random number within it using math.random, just because of the way JavaScript does random numbers. So this is really a zeroed range. It's important to note here, zeroed range is not the only potential good name for this variable. It's the one I thought of, but it's entirely likely that you could come up with a different name for it that also is a good name. It's always important to remember with programming that there are tons of ways to do any given task, not just one. Now we've got our zeroed range. So we're on to random. As I'm looking at this here, nothing really comes to mind with this. It's literally just we're taking math.random and removing all the weird extra symbols. Because really that's what this is a random value. You could rename it to random value or random val or something like that. I'm not really gonna bother. But, and this is the key, if I'm going through this and I realize later on that there's a better name for this variable, I'll just come up here and rename it. Let's go down to value. Whenever you see the word value, you should instantly be suspicious. It is very close to a nonsense name because it doesn't really tell you anything about the variable. And remember, the purpose of all this is that we can look at the code quickly and it's obvious what the code does. So looking at value, it's the random number times the zeroed range. It's the number we're selecting within the range, but it's still zeroed. Looking down here, we know that we eventually use that as an index for an array, but it's not an index yet because it's still a decimal. So I'm not going to add that into the variable. So what I'm going to do for now is I'm actually going to call it zeroed selection. No, actually, zeroed random. Nope, we'll do zeroed selection. So you can see I waffled a little bit there. I probably spent more time than I needed to on this particular variable because the exact name is we're doing just one step. We don't have to spend a long time. I just get a little bit OCD about this stuff and it bugs me if it's not right. It's a personal problem. So we've got our zeroed range and then a random, and then we get our zeroed selection, and then we unzero it. So that leaves us with, if I was using the same pattern, it would just be called selection, but I've already got selection down here, so I can't do that. So maybe instead of selection, I'll go back to value. But then I have value here, and that's not any good. That doesn't tell us anything. So the question is, what is this? So I've thought about this for a moment. I'm actually going to backtrack a little bit. I'm actually going to call this unrounded index. And again, we're not searching for the perfect name. We just want it to be accurate. That's the key here. Unrounded index is what it is. It's the index that we haven't rounded yet. Then value, oh, that's zeroed as well. And then this one, we're just unzeroing it. So we're just going to call this unrounded index. As a side note, you may be noticing that some of these variable names are really long, and you may think, oh, I don't want to type that out every time. There's two options here. One is better than the other. The first option is to shorten the words, and you end up with something like this, but that's very confusing if you don't have the context. But this really is just an old tradition from a time where computers had such a small amount of memory that you could only have like 8 characters in your variable name. So that's completely irrelevant now. So instead, what you want to do with these is have the long variable name and use autofill. It's not that hard. You just type ZER and then usually press tab. So like if I wanted to reference it down here, look at that. Boom, I don't have to type it out. So there's no excuse to not write out your variable names. And there's no reason not to have a long one unless it's so long that it becomes a pain in the butt to read. So we've got the 0 unrounded index, we've got the just unrounded index, and then we round it. So this, instead of rounded, I'm just gonna call it index. Because at this point, it's just the index of the thing in the array. And then finally this one, selection, nothing's coming to mind off the top of my head. It's the thing we've selected from the array. I think it's a decent name. It's not horrible, it's not nonsense. And so that's it. So that's step 2. We have now made all of these names accurate. You know what, actually? This name and this name, those are not accurate. Those are really ambiguous and really closer to a step 1 name. Index, I'm gonna change to index of selection. And again, in this step, it's okay to have really long variable names because the point is accuracy, not necessarily conciseness. Now with this one, instead of selection, I'm gonna call this random element. Because this is the random element that we have selected. So maybe this should be random index. And again, you don't always have to put this much work into it. I want to make sure there's good examples here. But normally what would happen is I would give it some like kind of okay names and come back to it later and be like, you know, actually that name doesn't make so much sense. I understand the code better now. And then you update the variable names as it starts to make more sense. But you don't have to do it all at once. And you know what? I'm going to change random to random %, because that's a little bit more accurate to what it actually holds, and it tells me what kind of information is in there. So now we've got honest names, and if you stop here, that's fine. You're gonna have better code than probably 85% of other developers. But there is one more step you can take that'll really take your coding up to the next level and give you clean, readable code in a way that most people just don't even write. And if you can internalize that step and get really good at it and to where you can do it really quickly, the result will be that you write really, really good code. So we've got our accurate names, we've got really good variable names that are maybe a little bit long, but they get the point across, and someone reading that code will know exactly what's happening, or at least have a really good idea of it. But if you want to really take it to the next level, you can go the extra mile and use what I call contextual names. Or if you're a fantasy nerd like me, true names. So when is it important to use contextual names over regular variable names? Because the fact of the matter is, taking it to the true naming level does take some effort and can take some time that you may need to spend elsewhere depending on the project, especially at first when you're still getting the hang of it. But there are some scenarios where it is definitely worth the time to invest into the naming of your variables so that they have a very good name. And the main scenarios for that are going to be when the code you're working on is a very important part of a much larger project, and you feel like other developers who use it are going to need some extra context in order to really understand what's going on. Another scenario where you might want to use contextual names would be if you're working with some code that has a really niche or just very specific or highly technical subject matter. For example, if you're using some particularly mathematical calculations, you may want to give particularly good names so that non-mathematicians can actually read your code. As a side note, though, what is a contextual name? What sets a contextual name apart from the other steps we've taken is that so far, all of our variable names have told us what is inside the variable. What does it hold? Does it hold an index for an array? Does it hold a randomly generated value? What does it hold? A contextual name is going to tell you why that variable is important. And in an ideal world, that includes some information about what it contains. So let's look at an example. So let's say that this is part of a video game. There's a video game that you're working on, and there's a list of enemies, and every so often one of the enemies spawns. And you don't care what kind, you just want to pick a random enemy. But let's also assume that the list of enemies is organized from weakest to strongest. So you want to have a range of enemies to pick from that are within a reasonable difficulty for the player. In that context, this function might be called something like random enemy, but it's not just a random enemy, clamped. So if you're not familiar with the idea of clamping within programming, it's basically just constricting a value to a range. So clamping basically just means keep it from going out of bounds. So I'm using that bit of terminology. This isn't a fantastic name. I'm not super happy with it, but we're not talking about functions right now. We're talking about variables. So I'm gonna leave it at that. Let's also go ahead and rename these. Again, we're talking about the variables, not the functions. I feel like parameters are more of a function thing, but it's still variables. So I'm gonna rename array to enemies. We're gonna call max instead max enemy level, and then min enemy level. And you can see already this has given us so much more context to work with. It's very interesting how just tiny little changes can make all the difference. So now let's go through and let's take these accurate names and make them contextual. So in this context, what is the zeroed range going to be called? What is a better name for it given the context? Go ahead and pause the video if you want, take a few seconds to think about it. When you do these names, it's totally appropriate to spend a little bit of extra time than you usually would on the name. But ultimately, you can always come back and give it a better variable name if you want. I'm gonna call this zeroed level range. Random percent, honestly, it's still just a random number, so I'm just gonna keep that the same. There's not really a lot of context to generating a random number. I think it would be completely reasonable to inline this variable, like I said. So now we've got zero unrounded index. What I'm gonna call this now is selected enemy. Remember, this is still unrounded, so we will have to account for that. So we've got the selected enemy is random percent times zeroed level range. You know what? That's not a level range, that's an enemy range. That's selected enemy. The unrounded index. Oh, nope, that's not the selected enemy. This is going to be, and you can see how this is a process. You don't always get it right the first time. You have to iterate. Let's call it enemy index. And then this one, I'm gonna call enemy index. I think that's a little bit better than selected enemy because it is technically the index, not the enemy itself. And what I'm gonna do here is I'm actually going to rename this to enemy index as well. And I'm gonna change this to a regular variable instead of a constant. And I'm gonna get rid of this const here. So what I'm doing here is really these are the same thing, I'm just rounding it. So I went ahead and just called it by the same name. Especially since we're doing contextual names now. Contextually speaking, there's no real reason to separate the unrounded from the rounded index. In fact, you could totally make this just on one line and do math.floor here. That's totally fine. There is no issue with this at all. But remember, one of the big purposes of these names is to have every single line of code have a minimized amount of mental and visual effort to read, so that you can read hundreds of thousands of lines of code without getting tired. That's the idea. So I'm gonna leave it like this. Oops, like this. I'm pretty pleased with that. And then instead of random element, you can see now, because we've made all these changes, everything is contextual now. So we've got enemies, enemy index. So we're getting a specific enemy. So this is actually going to be enemy. You could call it selected enemy if you want. I think that's even better than enemy. But there's a pretty good argument to be made that enemy is perfectly sufficient and contextual for this purpose. So you can see how applying the context can help a lot. And honestly, this isn't the best example for contextual naming. In this kind of situation, with a function this tiny all by itself, you really don't need contextual naming. But you can see how big of a difference it actually makes. It's pretty cool. And you know what? I'm gonna call this random enemy within range. So now we have the two different functions. Remember, these do exactly the same thing. And there is a temptation a lot of time to look at this first one and go, oh, but that's so much more elegant because it's short and only uses one line. But the thing to remember here is they do the same thing in the same number of steps. The only difference is this one tells you what's happening as it happens. This one leaves you to fend for itself. This visually doesn't take up as much space, but if you're in a situation where you're new to this section of code, and this is one of several hundred functions that you have to look through while you're debugging something, you don't want to have to debug this. This one is a lot easier to work with. And if it really bugs you that it takes up too many lines, you can make a couple little edits that make it take less lines. You can get rid of this variable altogether. It's really not that important. You can use math.random. And you could pretty easily get rid of selected enemy as well. And now all of a sudden it's a much smaller function. And those are just edits I made off the top of my head. So that's about it for making good variable names. Of course, it's a rabbit hole. You could go down as deep as you want, but it can be a fun rabbit hole to go down if you enjoy that kind of thing. If you like this video and want to see more like it, don't forget to press the like and subscribe buttons down below. I think the bell helps too. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the comments below. And let me know if there are any other topics you want to see me talk about. I hope you'll join me for the next video. And until that time, I'll see you later.